Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Full Potential Parenting Podcast. I'm Allison Morris, and today I wanted to go a little bit deeper into understanding trauma. It's become very common in trauma-informed circles to say that we need to move beyond the question, what's wrong with you, right? That we might ask a child who has quote unquote misbehaved or done something wrong. Or even that we might ask an adult who kind of, doesn't have their life together or is making bad choices. And that we move away from that and instead ask the question, what happened to you? Which is an acknowledgement, right, that people might have some traumatic events in their past. They might have experienced some adverse childhood events. And while that is definitely a step in the right direction, I want to explain why I think that doesn't go far enough. The issue is that trauma is not about so much what happened to you, but how you responded to what happened to you. It's a very subjective sort of thing. So two people might have gone through exactly the same event or experience, but for a host of reasons, their body, their mind, had a very different experience of it, and they responded to it very differently. And the reasons for this are, again, manyfold. It could be intergenerational patterns of trauma that have been inherited through one person and not to another. I believe the research now shows that inherited trauma can be passed down something like 13 generations, which is kind of, that's a really long time and not something that we would necessarily know about. Something like surviving the Holocaust, obviously that's a major event that people, that might be kind of passed down through your family history, but a lot of other things you're not necessarily going to know about. It could be just because of differences in the stress level of your mother while you were in the womb. So in utero exposure to stress is one of the factors that can leave people more predisposed to going into fight or flight mode, right? If your birth mother, your mother, was in a lot of arguments, under a lot of stress at work, maybe, gosh, there could have been, whatever the situation might be, then that baby was essentially, the brain was developing in a cortisol bath. That the stress hormone cortisol played a big role in the development of that baby's nervous system. Whereas a different baby may have had a very different experience in the womb. The actual birthing process can help determine all sorts of things about the baby's health. There are just so many different aspects of this, and many of them, right, we're never going to necessarily be able to pinpoint. And to a certain extent, they don't matter. What really matters is how did that person respond, and how is it still affecting them today? So I'd just like to encourage you to not necessarily make any assumptions about anybody's history, about their past, and certainly I would encourage you not to make any judgments about whether somebody should have been able to cope better with something. So another thing that is kind of a popular saying in the trauma field is that there's no hierarchy of trauma. And this may sound a little bit puzzling, right? It seems sort of intuitively obvious that some things are not as bad as other things. And yet we just can't know how any particular nervous system has encountered any experience. So it's not up to us to figure out that being left behind, like forgotten at daycare, for instance, so that a young baby or a child felt like they'd been abandoned forever, and the terror that may have produced in them, is that any better or is that worse than a different kind of physical or sexual abuse? Or is that worse than not having your needs met and crying and not being consoled? We can't know how different people have responded to the events that they have encountered in their life. And so I want to just encourage you to be more aware of some of the complexities surrounding all of this. And again, not to make assumptions about how somebody should have responded. It wasn't such a big deal. Oh, I was, you know, forgotten somewhere and I turned out fine. All of these sort of dismissive sorts of things that are, easy to say, but they don't really honor any one particular person's lived experience and how it has affected them. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today, is the concept that trauma is really not so much about the experience itself, but way more about how our bodies respond to it, whether we're able to integrate it, process it, release it, or whether we are still carrying a lot of the stress response, the fight, flight, or freeze response that arose in our body while we were trying to manage, cope, respond to that event, and whether we were able to release that or whether we're still carrying that around. So we'll go into all of that and more about polyvagal theory and different states of the nervous system in a future episode. But I want to thank you so much for joining me today, and hope I've given you a little something to think about. And as always, I want to encourage you to hop on over to parentingmasterclass.com if you'd like to get a hold of a free masterclass over there. So that's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Allison Morris with Full Potential Parenting, and I'll say bye-bye.